Joining us now from outside the Supreme Court in Washington to talk more about the Supreme Court rulings today, NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, thanks for joining us. I want to start with the abortion case out of Texas. I erroneously suggested before that Justice Kennedy had never voted, or that he was a reliably pro-choice vote on the court. He's not on partial birth abortion. He voted on the pro-life side. Where does Justice Kennedy stand now in terms of abortion and the role of the court?
Well, partial birth abortion, remember, the court struck down a Nebraska law that stopped these so-called partial birth abortions. Then came the federal law, and that's when Justice Kennedy wrote the decision, which alarmed advocates of abortion rights. But I think that was a bridge too far for him. This really gets back to the main holding of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the big case 25 years ago, that today the Supreme Court picks up the language on it. What they say is that these two restrictions in Texas, saying that doctors have to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals and the clinics have to be built to the same standards as surgical centers in terms of equipment, staffing, construction standards, and so forth, they add to the obstacles that make it harder to get an abortion, but they don't add any medical benefits. And for that reason, he said it's an undue burden, echoing the language of Casey. So it's surprising, though. During the oral argument, Kennedy seemed not to be willing to go that far, and he seemed to be concerned about the facts in the case. And he suggested even at one point sending it back for more development about, well, okay, which law caused which clinics to close, so we know how these two laws work differently. But clearly he joined the four more liberal justices, and that gave us this 5-3 ruling that would have had the same outcome even if Antonin Scalia had still been on the court. It would have just been 5-4.
Pete, talk about the implications of this for other states around the country. There are obviously a bunch of states that have similar provisions as the Texas law in various regards. Some have actually been modeled on the Texas law. What happens now in all those states?
Immediately nothing. This ruling today applies only to Texas, but what will happen is the opponents of those laws will take the ruling, they'll go back into court, and they'll say, look, the same logic applies here in our state as applied to Texas. We want these laws struck down, and I would expect for the most part they'll win. So those laws are going to be in big trouble. And this wedge of laws, this dozen or so laws like Texas, was a new strategy for opponents of abortion. After years of going after the patients by restricting women's access by saying you got to have counseling or there's a waiting period or reducing the period of time during pregnancy when abortion is legal, they said, well, that's not working. Let's go after the clinics and the doctors, and today they lost.
Pete, how do you explain unanimous ruling from the justices on the Bob McDonnell case you from the prosecutor making a decision? A federal prosecutor sees this as not only a good prosecution to bring, but earns a conviction. How can you reconcile that with the unanimous view of the court?
All you had to do is hear the oral argument. There wasn't a single justice that was a big cheerleader for the prosecution of Bob McDonnell. Now, today, the Chief Justice who wrote this unanimous opinion said that it's pretty tawdry what the former governor did. But the essence of the case is, what's an official act? The federal law says you violate the law if you take something like he got here, cash and gifts, in exchange for performing official acts. So that was the question, what's an official act? And the court said today, the kind of stuff that Governor McDonnell did, setting up meetings, talking to staffers, hosting lunches, that's garden variety stuff that government officials do all the time. That's not an official act. An official act, they said, is when you have a decision pending and you vote on it or you influence that decision. So as a technical matter, the case is sent back. The appeals court can look at it again and see if there's a point in a retrial. But basically, they send the prosecution back severely handicapped. And not only this case, but it's going to make it harder for prosecutors to bring corruption cases against other public officials. You know, those two legislators up in New York State, their cases are on hold, waiting for the Supreme Court decision for their sentence. The lawyer for Robert Menendez, who faces a corruption charge from the federal government, that he did favors for an eye doctor from Florida in return for travel and so forth, that case could be affected by this. So it's going to, every time the Supreme Court rules to toughen the corruption laws, it takes a while for it to work through the courts before you really know how big an effect it had.
Great.